Okay, hi everybody. If you remember last time we met, we were looking at, we were really comparing experimental research design and quasi-experimental research. We saw that the independent and dependent variables when it comes to experimental research, the independent variable is the treatment, and the dependent variable is the behavior that is focused on as the potential outcome of treatment. And we saw that what made experimental research experimental is random assignment of participants from one single group or of one single pool of potential participants. So I think we looked at a study last week, again, involving children with specific language impairment. So there was a single body of participants that were gathered, and then randomly one group was assigned to receive a treatment and the other group was assigned to the control group. And that group did not receive the treatment. I think the treatment that we looked at last week involved the clinician's response to a child's error in an intervention. And there were two kinds of responses. Everything was held the same across experimental and control group, except for a clinician's requirement that the child reproduce the error response, in the experimental group, that experimental group repeated the error response and corrected it, whereas the control group received a model of the correct response, but did not have to produce it themselves. What made that experimental, among other things, was, again, that subjects came from one pool, in that case a pool of children with specific language impairment, and they were assigned either to receive one treatment, that is one kind of response to error, or the other treatment, the other kind of response to error. They were assigned to one of those two groups randomly, random assignment out of a single pool. Groups of participants, each with their own unique characteristics. So there was a typically achieving group that was, we presume, the control group, and then there was the group with the disability, and the typically achieving children and the group with the disability are compared according to some behavioral characteristic that is the focus of the study. Now, this research article that we looked at last week was the ability of children with language impairment to dissemble emotions in hypothetical and natural situations. And I think I ended the session by asking you, what do you think was the independent variable of that study? And that kind of independent variable really represents the kind of independent variable that is endemic, that is basic, that's intrinsic to quasi-experimental research. And I can also and did also ask you what the dependent variable was of this particular study. So what did you think? Well, in a study in which children with disability are compared with a matched group of children who are typically achieving, it seems to me that the independent variable there is disability. It is disability. The question is, does disability contribute, or are characteristics of behavior that are evaluated in the study. Are they a consequence? Are they associated with disability? They are manipulating disability. So one group of participants, in a sense, has the treatment. The treatment is disability. And the other group of participants does not have the treatment, does not have the disability. And they are in this particular research, they were looking at how people with disability compared to people without disability, who are typically achieving, in the ability to dissemble emotions. And if we remember how dissemblance was operationalized, it had to do with how in a particular, when the children were presented a particular scenario, whether the children were able to talk about hiding their real emotions and instead commenting to an adult that something that they found distasteful was good. I think an example I gave you last week in my own family has to do with kids visiting my sister and having a dinner that they may not have enjoyed, but they know to tell my sister that her cooking was quite good. And if they don't want to eat, if they choose not to eat much of it, they usually come up with an excuse such as, well, we ate before we came, or we were bad and we had a snack, candy, and it really messed up our appetite. So they are dissembling their emotion of finding the situation distasteful or uncomfortable with reference to the emotional needs of the individual that they are interacting with. That's dissemblance. And in this particular study that we looked at, the individuals were presented or read or a hypothetical situation. They were also looked at dissemblance in context of what they called a natural situation. But the number one, my point is, bottom line point I want to make, in a quasi-experimental research, which I'm calling quasi-experimental because there is no random assignment of subjects, or participants, excuse me, we call them participants these days. There is no random assignment of participants from a central pool of subjects. Instead, again, I use the term subjects when I should say participants, it's my age. This group of participants. Instead, the design starts out with one group of individuals with a disability and one group of individuals who are typically achieving, the treatment being the disability. And the outcome is, and the dependent variable is, the performance, the behavior that is being evaluated, in this case, dissemblance behavior, if you're following me. Now, it is true that there really is another independent variable in this study, I believe, and that is nature of scenario. Nature of scenario. So one could, among the two groups and comparing the two groups, the question is dissemblance, is there what is the relationship between scenario and dissemblance behavior in typically achieving and children with SLI? So that is a second independent variable. They're manipulating scenario and looking at dissemblance behavior. But once there is a comparison made of dissemblance behavior in typically achieving children and dissemblance behavior in kids with a disability, then the independent variable becomes the disability. Following me? That I then will say the following, that the ability to infer a cause in the research becomes very weak, very weak. What do I mean by that? Well, if you find that children with disability have perform significantly poorer than kids with ability, who are typically achieving, or significantly different in any way, can you conclude that it's the disability that causes the poor performance? I believe that you cannot make such a conclusion because, first of all, what it is that is underlying the disability has not been manipulated. So to say that, for example, SLI, language impairment, leads to poor dissemblance behavior, you can't say that. You can simply say it is related to that the children with this disability or disability label manifest this behavioral characteristic in a way that's somewhat different than children who are typically achieving. But what causes that, what in that individuals lead to the dissemblance issues, is not being manipulated, you see. We don't know. You can't make that conclusion. You can simply make a correlational conclusion. And that's exactly what happens, that in most of these kinds of studies, the kids with disability do poorer than the typically achieving, or at best, there isn't a significant difference. They typically don't do better, that's for sure. They typically do worse. And that's because it seems to me the design of the study kind of contributes to that, in that what the researchers do is based on reports or the conceptualization that this kind of behavioral problem will be associated with the disability, thus presents this group with a situation that almost predictably leads to a problematic performance. But the research, quasi-experimental research, where again, typically achieving children are compared to kids with disability, such research doesn't usually get to the cause, the underlying contribution to the poorer performance, you see. And that is, I would say, a weakness of the research, which is not to say that there's nothing valuable that comes out of it. There is certainly recognizing that, for example, perhaps a theory of mind, and subsequently, or related to that, dissemblance behaviors are something that maybe we should take a look at as clinicians. But just to say that in quasi-experimental research, the independent variable is disability, and at the end of the day, the research does not allow us to draw a causal conclusion. On the other hand, experimental research, where there's random assignment out of a pool, so that both groups, two groups of children who represent a population are receiving a treatment, and then their outcomes are being compared, well, that does allow you to come to a causal conclusion, a cause and effect conclusion. Why? Because you're manipulating the treatment across the groups, you see. And you know what you're doing. You know what you're manipulating. And therefore, the treatment can be related logically in a causal way to the outcome, if there is a difference between those individuals who receive the treatment and those individuals who don't. In a quasi-experimental study, two groups did not get the same treatment. You see, two groups did not get a treatment. Only one group got the disability treatment. The other group was typically achieving. Of course, it would have been unethical to do something to the typically achieving children to make them disabled. That would be highly unethical and not something I would recommend or countenance, of course. So therefore, thus the difference, okay? That's as far as I'm going to go with this right now. Read through the studies again and think about that a little bit. About validity, internal validity and validity related to instrumentation. And the point I want to make relates to the homework assignment that I had given everybody, that forum that dealt with the identification of dependent and independent variables in structural studies. And I also encourage you to identify independent and dependent variables in experimental studies and in quasi-experimental studies. And you will be doing that as you do your summary, by the way, of the research summaries that I've asked you to do. I noticed that in some cases what students did was reported the problem statement, that is, both the independent and dependent variable together as a variable. But I am urging you or directing you to try to work on separating out the independent and dependent variables. Separate them out and recognize that an independent variable or a dependent variable, any variable, is just one thing. It's just one thing that's being manipulated. For example, in the experimental study we reviewed, what was manipulated was treatment, that is, response, one little bit of a response to a child's error, right? That was manipulated, and there were two versions of that occurred. One was model and encourage the child to repeat, to reproduce the response and correct themselves, and one in which a model was presented and no encouragement to reproduce was presented. That's it. One thing. It can be summed up one way, in one way, and that is the treatment was clinician cueing behavior. That was, or clinician response to error. Clinician response to the child's error. That was the independent variable. It was one thing. And the dependent variable is one thing. In that case, it was children's, each variable is one thing. There may be multiple variables. So the dependent variable in that experimental study was one thing. And that was the child's correct, I think it was articulation. I believe it was articulation, if I'm correct, or production of a morpheme. I don't remember off the top of my head here. That was the one thing. Now, there was, in fact, a second dependent variable, and that was what? Yeah, it was maintenance. Maintenance over several months, I think it was, or weeks of the corrected response. But maintenance is one thing. Production of a morpheme or or of a sound, that's one thing. Clinician response to a child's error, that's one thing. Following me? When you're asked to identify a variable, and when you read research and work to understand it, separate out the variables and recognize that each variable is just one thing, where the independent variable is the treatment thing, or the thing that's viewed as causal or as promoting or provoking the dependent variable, and the dependent variable is the behavioral outcome. And I tried to show you that structural, experimental, and quasi-experimental research each has a different kind of independent variable and a different kind of dependent variable. So work on that, okay? And if I critiqued you in my review of your homework, try to go back into the research and separate out these variables and then identify them try to work on identifying the individual thing that's being either manipulated or evaluated as an outcome, okay? Okay. One more point about the homework and the material that I have posted in the as articles in the Blackboard. They're not all research articles. Some of the material that I posted for you, particularly those articles on qualitative research, there are a number of articles that are theoretical in nature or explanatory, expository in nature. They're explaining. The articles on qualitative research explain the importance and argue for the importance of qualitative research in speech-language pathology and define qualitative research. They're not research articles themselves. Therefore, they cannot be used for an assignment in which I'm requesting that you identify